Well, Sasha Knezev, author and filmmaker, joins me from Los Angeles to discuss this. Sasha, the U.S. went into Afghanistan because of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Now, Afghan President Hamid Karzai is saying the U.S. is no longer fighting the Taliban. I mean, doesn't this question the whole reason for invading and occupying Afghanistan?
Well, I think we have to look at this in the context of the history of the Taliban. We obviously know that the Taliban was created by Zbigniew Brzezinski. This was all illustrated in his book, The Grand Chessboard. But I think we also need to look in the history of Karzai. Remember, Karzai initially did support the Taliban in the 90s, although he did believe they were used by the ISI, which was the Pakistani intelligence, but he did initially. And then, of course, he changed his mind after siding with the UK and the United States, and then they used Karzai for other, U.S. interests that was just to enhance the fracturing and the fragmentation of the area. I think that this was all, the entire purpose of, Karzai's administration, which also is, I think, illustrated perfectly by Army General Martin Dempsey, who just as recently as a couple of weeks ago stated that the United States was going to stay in Afghanistan until at least the end of 2014. Now, this will coincide with the beginning of the next election cycle in the United States, but this continued rupturing of the area and fragmentation between the Taliban and the Karzai administration is what the United States does and its Western allies. I mean, we have to remember when the United States military goes into foreign occupying land, they don't leave. We still have troops in Kosovo. We still have troops in Japan. We see no ending to the troops in obviously Iraq, and so on and so forth. I think we should also look into the fact that in October of this year, it will mark the 12 years of this war in Afghanistan. Now, the war in Vietnam lasted approximately 15, 16 years. So we're almost at that point, but the difference is that, the United States as an industrial capacity was much more stronger in the 50s and 60s and early 70s during Vietnam. We cannot afford this economically. It's time to bring our troops home, and I think this is just going to spell a catastrophe for the United States in terms of foreign policy and most specifically the economy.
And very briefly, I mean, what now? What should we expect to see in the ties between the U.S. and Afghanistan as well as the Taliban?
Well, again, I go back to Zbigniew Brzezinski's book, The Grand Chessboard, where this was all illustrated perfectly. I think the entire preoccupation of that area is to surround the area Eurasia, which was to put a stranglehold ultimately on Russia and on China. This preceded the PNAC report, the Project for the New American Century, which was drafted prior to 9/11 and prior to the U.S. troops going into Afghanistan and into Iraq. So this strategy, this grand strategy of foreign policy, neo-American imperialism, again, was drafted a long time ago. This was, again, perfectly illustrated in Zbigniew Brzezinski's book, who created openly and admittedly the Taliban. So I think ultimately the goal is to, stay in Afghanistan, perpetuate this war in the Middle East, and go on to the ultimate goal of surrounding the Eurasia area of Russia and China.
All right, so we'll have to leave it there. Many thanks, to Sasha Knezev, author and filmmaker from Los Angeles. Thanks for your time there, sir. Starting off in Syria, where insurgents suffer heavy losses after clashes with government troops over control of a key highway in Damascus. The army, backed by warplanes, battled the foreign-backed insurgents a day after they cut off the strategic artery near the capital. The army also confronted insurgents in several other areas. In Aleppo, several militants were killed and their equipment and vehicles destroyed. Government soldiers also carried out a series of operations against armed groups in Idlib province, inflicting heavy losses on them. Well, to tell us more about the situation in Syria, I'm joined from Washington by Dr. Webster Tarpley, author and historian. Welcome to the program, sir. Doctor, we see the Syrian army gaining ground in Syria. This while Muaz al-Khatib from the opposition has called for dialogue with the Syrian government. At the same time, NATO allies, Turkey and US, are at loggerheads over Israel's recent attack on Syria. Now, putting these together, how should we interpret the situation altogether?
I think this adds up to very bad news for these foreign-backed rebels, the death squads and the terrorists that have been shipped in by NATO from abroad. As soon as Khatib began talking about negotiations, it seemed to me that that was an obvious sign that the rebels were afraid that their effort would collapse and they were trying to make a deal. We've also had these rumors about the Israelis creating a buffer zone on Syrian territory where presumably the death squads could take shelter. That looks like another sign that the rebellion may be in bad shape. Then, as you say, the losses inflicted by the Syrian army on the rebels seem to be increasing, the rebels increasingly unable to hold any territory. And let me add a piece of bad news here from Washington. It has just come out now that there was a debate in the Obama regime last October, and we had the leading warmonger, the leading neocon, General David Petraeus, the head of the CIA, joined by, inevitably, Hillary Clinton, who's always got to be on the side of escalation because of her weakness, plus Panetta at the Pentagon, plus Dempsey, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So all four of these heavies came to Obama and said, we want to give more and better and bigger weapons to the Syrian rebels. And Obama said no. Now, some are saying, well, that only meant during the election campaign. But it has now come out, and it looks like Obama has essentially made a decision that he's not going to tie his fortunes to the Syrian death squads, which I think is rather ominous for them. Naturally, part of the debate was that Saudi Arabia and Qatar continue to furnish these weapons, but therefore the U.S. wouldn't do it. There's also a great fear here of the shoulder-fired so-called man-pads, the smaller missiles that could be used to shoot down airliners. Great fear that those would fall into the hands of the Nusra Brigade. So, on the whole, a bad scene for the rebels.
Indeed. Well, just to add to that, a shocking report has also emerged. There are also reports of the insurgents training child soldiers. I mean, are we going to see another generation of killing machines, as these insurgents have called them?
Well, it's to be hoped that this will not become something like Lebanon in the 1970s, and I think there are reasons why it wouldn't. We have to remember that the overwhelming ingredient in Syria is provided by foreign powers. That is, a lot of the fighters have been shipped in from all different parts of the world, right? We had stories about a whole bunch of Pakistani Taliban getting killed, fighting on the side of the rebellion. If you had a situation where the rebellion was losing momentum, as it is now, runs out of forces inside the country, it's not really backed up by indigenous forces. It's largely a foreign creation. And if the foreigners get tired and go away, then I think Syria could revert to some kind of normalcy, which would be much better for all concerned.
Indeed. Dr. Webster Tarpley, author and historian from Washington. Thanks for your thoughts as always, sir.